are listening to Cover Stories, a deep dive into the stories behind iconic album art with Adam and Charlie O.
Pyromania, no question. Burn the building. Burn, burn, burn.
Game on. These were the words spoken by Senator Paula Hawkins on September 19, 1985, as she opened the rock porn hearings while holding up a copy of the album art for Def Leppard's third album, Pyromania, released January 20th, 1983. The Parents Music Resource Center Senate hearings over objectionable lyrics and themes in music was kicked off by a litany of complaints from the Washington wives, and Hawkins started with album art, saying, "Today we're raising the question, how far should society go to keep young children from being exposed to images and words which may run counter to parents' values and beliefs in decency?" The record album covers, to me, are self-explanatory. That was not the last controversy the cover would land in. Pyromania would find itself in the media for this cover once again after the 9/11 attacks on the Twin Towers in New York City. This is the story behind the cover. Craig Thomas was an engineer working on the making of the album, and the band was having a bad time getting the Marshall amps to sound good on the album. At one point, guitarist Steve Clark and Leppard Mutt Lang suggested the band take them into the garden and burn them. Thomas piped up in a brilliant, broad Scottish brogue, "Ark, you all just a bunch of pyromaniacs." Joe Elliott said, "That's where the album name came from, pure accident. That is outside input of a sort, but on a definite inside trait, and definitely not, I've got an idea for the album sort of thing." So, Pyromania it would be. Elliott said the album cover was the final piece to be put into place. They turned to Andy Airfix to design the cover. Let Elliott tell the story. "It was Andy Airfix. It was our first time working with Andy because we used hypnosis on High and Dry, which was an itch we had to scratch because being Zeppelin, UFO, Pink Floyd fans, it's like, we gotta use those guys. And we did. Done." Andy Airfix was suggested, and he came in really enthusiastic. This guy was so enthusiastic, I don't want to step on his toes here. We gotta let him go with something. Airfix, asked to describe the brief for the album, said, "It was a difficult one because Peter Mensch called me up and said, 'Look, we need a meeting. The band, they're not your average heavy rock band.' Mensch said to him, 'Def Leppard are different to your average heavy rock band. The sleeve needs to reflect that. We've all had enough of tattoos, terrible pictures of half-naked women riding motorcycles, and fire-breathing monsters. It's all too cliched now. We need something different, more modern. We need to go back to basics. We need to redefine the image of heavy rock.'" Airfix said it was quite a task from the very beginning to have a fresh approach to it, but obviously at the same time still maintain what rock and roll meant. It had to be pretty full on, even though the imagery might be different. Airfix took the title and decided to stretch the concept to its extreme. He said, "What I had in my head as an image was something. The word pyromania was obviously a starting point. So we have to have fire. We have to have flames. I just tried to think of the biggest scale of that kind of power. So the burning building was a kind of starting point. But it had to become much more than that. We wanted to be slightly futuristic. I tried to envision what would constitute an attack on our materialistic world that would be totally unacceptable. An attack on a skyscraper was what I came up with. The sight, aimed at the building, emphasized the attack was a deliberate action." Elliott said, "There wasn't a great deal of development. I think from the original drawing, which would have been, if you want to call it, the black and white napkin drawing of the front cover, it didn't really change a great deal because it's not a photograph. It's a cartoon or whatever you want to call it. It's a painting. I do remember the very first draft of it had a white framing, and we all went, "That looks really crap." And I do remember one of us getting a Sharpie and just coloring it in. It needs to be black. And we went with the black, and everybody agreed the black was the way to go. So that part of it was really easy. Airfix brought in Bernard Goodenus, an illustrator specializing in futuristic designs. I did that. I basically sketched out what I wanted, and very quite clearly, in fact. But then, not being an illustrator per se, then I had to find someone who could execute the idea. It was drawn up pretty much as you see now, but I needed a really good airbrush artist to do it, which I'm not expert in, because one of the things I've learned over time is you can't do everything. You hire the best people to do particular things. And this guy had come to me literally 2 weeks before and showed me his portfolio. I was very impressed with it. So I gave him what you see there, but my version of it, which was obviously rougher. And he modified it, made it sharper, made it more futuristic, I think, is what he did. Airfix went on. We sketched out ideas, including a magnified section of the exploding building, which I would build the graphic site around. It was demanding work for both of us to get it exactly right. Exactly right is always a good aim. I had already decided the illustration should be contained within a border which smoke could pour into, creating a further dimension to the design. The site itself added another, the viewer, you. The site as a piece of graphics may seem complicated and detailed, but it had to imply a weapon much bigger than a rifle sight, a rocket launcher perhaps. Airfix conveniently diverged from Elliott's version of how the border changed from white to black, saying, "The border was originally going to be white to emphasize the smoke, but a black one proved to be more powerful." Airfax praised Goodenus's use of dynamics by creating the view from the ground level. The artwork has sort of a Marvel comic look to it, Airfax explained. "I think that's the nature of it. We wanted it to be slightly futuristic, which I guess you know kind of related to what you're talking about in that sort of comic book style. It's more sophisticated than a comic, but I guess its references are quite similar." Elliott was not happy with the rear cover. He said, "What I do remember being funny was the back, because when the album first came out, we didn't have a running order. So the album cover, at least the first few pressings, the song titles were all over the place in the wrong orders. And the photographs, we were scrambling for pictures. You know, we did a photo session for High and Dry. They were all shoulders up topless. But for Pyromania, we wanted to use live shot, and everybody got to pick their own individual shot. The back was just like, you wouldn't do it now as an established band. You wouldn't go, this is really good. It's like no good. It was like shit." At some point after the 9/11 attacks, Airfix met with the band. He and Elliott both admitted that the first thing they thought of when they saw the World Trade Center on fire was Pyromania's cover. Elliott said, "Let's not hide behind the fact that it is alarmingly like 9/11. That did strike us when it happened. We actually discussed, should we change the sleeve? But we realized, A, it's a piece of history. It's not our doing, and it's just an insanely awful coincidence. So if we're to change every bit of art that foresaw a terrible situation like that, we'd be changing a lot of art. So, you know what I mean? Rewriting history is something everybody is trying to do with language these days. But I don't think there's any point in doing it with the live stuff, with visuals. Sorry, because it is what it is. It wasn't intended to represent anything that would happen in the future. It was just explosive pyromania. Bang, boom, fire, you know?" Guitarist Phil Collins said, "I remember someone from the record company asking producer Mutt Lange why the album was taking so long. He said, "So you'll be talking about it in 40 years' time." He wasn't wrong. Let's hit the pause button and chat a bit.
So it might be too late for love, but it's the perfect time for your favorite podcast. How's it going? We're here today discussing Def Leppard's 1983 breakthrough album, Pyromania. So it's funny, I can remember very few of my rock beefs with my brother John, aside from the eternal question of Metallica versus Guns N' Roses. Okay. But he went all in on 1987's Hysteria. But it just never clicked for me. I was far too young to not take Pour Some Sugar on Me, but Hysteria didn't reach me. It still hasn't, if I'm honest, but these tend to be the episodes that I actually look forward to the most. Forcing myself to engage with something I've either longed to ride it or avoided. Now, one thing I'll say for Def Leppard, the band was really unfairly lumped into that whole hair metal crowd. The Poisons, the Motley Crue, the Warrant, the Cinderella. But, it was honestly only down to timing. They pre-exist all those teased bangs and spandex acts that littered the 80s. But one thing that always pushed me away from Def Leppard, and I heard this some years back, was their insistence that their moniker was changed from the properly spelled Def Leppard to distance themselves from punk. My younger brain, and frankly my current brain, fails to understand why anyone would want to do that, but hey, there's no role in punk, right? It's just
That's right. That's right. There's no rule.
So give me Def Leppard. What's your background there?
I'm just going to ask you. I never thought of Def Leppard as punk. I
not at
metal.
All.
They're a metal band.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
But Joe Elliott, I think, was quoted as saying, we changed the name to this misspelled stylized version so that no one thought that we were a punk band.
Right. Okay, gotcha.
And there was a lot of that.
Yeah.
At the time, you didn't want to be a punk band.
I like the sound of Def Leppard, but they just don't do any songs I like.
Okay.
I mean, Pour Some Sugar on Me, that was okay for 5 minutes. But when I hear it now, it's real easy to switch the channel from that. I like the sound. They do have rock and roll, but
for sure, yeah.
I don't know their music much. I never sat and listened to their albums. I was radio exposure to them, so I don't know that I can really be fair to the band.
And they sat in a weird place for me. I think, this probably, for rock fans, this is probably verboten, but Van Halen kind of always was the same for me. Van Halen and these really polished, Bon Jovi type bands of the 80s. Not that there weren't great songs, but I just haven't heard them. Photograph from this album that we're talking about today, though, is a pretty solid tune. I can stand behind that one.
Okay.
So here on Album Art Cover Stories, we don't seem ever far away from the PMRC. Now, as much as I despise the idea of this Tipper Gore-led war on art, what I do appreciate is that, we've mentioned this before, the parental advisory sticker led me directly to the albums that I wanted to listen to,
This is the music you want to hear.
Yeah. Now, I wasn't aware of this, but the financial backing for the PMRC was provided by two major parties. One was a beer brand, and the other was a band from California, a long-running band from California. Any guesses for either one of these?
Well, I think I can eliminate the Grateful Dead as the band.
Yes, they were certainly not pushing for censorship.
That's right. Yeah. And let's say the beer. Is that Budweiser or something, or Anheuser-Busch?
So here we go.
I don't know. I'm blank on both.
The beer brand, who I will coin the term least rock and roll beer brand of all time, Coors.
Ah, okay.
And the band themselves, the Beach Boys. So I guess that's why we have Grateful Dead and Pabst Blue Ribbon. But pretty interesting side notes there. But it's hard to imagine this album cover being a controversy. Aside from the 9/11, timestamp. But to me, it's hardly any more offensive than, say, Die Hard was. What makes music so different from movies? That there wasn't this PMRC for movies at the time. But let's get into the name a bit, because I tend to think that's actually where the controversy comes from.
Well, but I do want to back up just a little bit to say
please.
that this Senator Hawkins, she started off, the video I found, she started off with the words "Game On," and the first thing she did was took a picture of Pyromania and stuck it up there, and that was the line in the sand.
So let's dig into this name a little bit, Pyromania. Now, again, that's what I think is truly at the heart of some of the controversy. The engineer Craig Thomas remembers the band's superstar producer Mutt Lange, I'm guessing jokingly threatened to burn their Marshall amps after failing to nail
just
the guitar
frustrated.
tone.
Yeah. That gave birth to the title.
And interestingly enough, it's the guitar tone that pushes me away from this band. It's so damn clean and it's so 80s, but it really takes the edge off that rock and roll. But, speaking of Mutt Lange, aside from calling the guys some wild pyromaniacs, he's been at the helm of some of rock and roll's biggest albums and was once married to a woman who boasts the single best-selling album by a female solo artist ever. Guess time again. Who is that?
She's, I don't know celebrity royalty, but Madonna comes to mind for some reason.
Shania Twain.
Shania Twain. Okay.
Yes. Never the Shania Twain shall meet. So Andy Airfix gets the...
Right, yeah.
That sounds like a fake artist name, but is that his real name?
But yeah. Well,
real name.
apparently.
As far as we know,
calls him, yeah.
He gets the gig because the band was very clearly influenced by the work he did with Zeppelin and Floyd, who I'm sure they were also big fans of musically. That's probably where they found it first.
That's where it started, yeah. They were fans.
I do always love getting into a visual artist catalog because I had no clue he also worked closely with Metallica in the 90s, among others. Mm-hmm. We've dug into a few of Metallica's pieces, and he did the follow-up to one of their most controversial covers, which I'm sure we'll get to in our future episodes. But the discussion regarding Def Leppard's image, to me, is an interesting one. They have a lot more to do with the new wave of British heavy metal, as people call it, new album, as if that's not a mouthful itself, that took England by storm in the mid-'70s. It gave us people like Iron Maiden, Diamond Head, Judas Priest. So Def Leppard, really straddles an interesting line. By the time they reached Mass Hysteria on 1987's Hysteria, the pop sheen, again, is what, in my opinion, really set them apart. But Pyromania is where that all began. They were looking for a more modern sound and image. And it's funny because though heavy rock bands at the time were known for covers sporting leather-clad, half-naked women and all variations of fantastical beasts, Def Leppard's previous album, High and Dry, did you catch a look at that cover?
I didn't, I'm ashamed to say.
It looks like an art house piece. It looks like...
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, it's really, really cool. Now, the first one sadly looks a lot like Stephen King's... what I'm going to call Maximum Overdrive of the 18-wheelers that become possessed and go after people. But High and Dry, their previous albums, really cool. But I will say here, Pyromania is also pretty cool. I mean, what's your first thought when you see this album cover?
Comic book. It was neat, it just looked like the comic books that I grew up with.
Cool.
Like somebody was taking out a building, and this was well before 9/11, which I'm sure we'll touch on before we get out of here. But yeah, it just seemed like a comic book.
Oh,
It looked like it was waiting for Superman to appear outside the window, stand there in midair, and then dash in and save everybody on the floor.
Yeah.
That's the impression I get from it.
Do you care to step outside?
Yeah.
Let's step back inside. But it's an odd image to call rock and roll. I think that they were going for they were going for reinvention, and Airfix only had the word Pyromania as his prompt, but he took it to the absolute limit. But I've got some minor quibbles here because I got into the language behind some of this and did a little research of my own. Is it still Pyromania if you're not technically starting a manual fire?
Well, that's arson.
Yeah.
That's an arsonist.
That's right.
So this wasn't called arsonist. This was Pyromania.
You're just obsessed with it.
Yeah. You just whoever starts it, whether you start it or somebody else does, you're just entranced by it. You're going to stand there and watch it to the last ash.
Yeah, there's like a pseudo-sexual element to it. The guy watching from behind the bushes across the street.
Bingo.
You're not going to do that when you're taking what's probably a rocket launcher and sending it screaming towards a skyscraper. But how did the site manage to make an explosion? But these are more questions for a show like Mythbusters.
That's right. Yeah.
I found it all a bit funny, but the artist does get the final say, I suppose. But I don't really see a quote unquote attack on our materialistic world, as he said.
Well, I think if we could go back in time, it is a building that looks sort of like a twin tower building.
It's very corporate,
and a symbol of American economy, corporate America. That these would be people high up there in the offices with a great view and big salaries and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
I could see it back in its time that maybe it was a symbol of corporate America.
All right, you flip me back in a little bit. Okay, I'll take that. I like that. So just picture the women with the shoulder pads and the tennis shoes in their purse walking to the office. But you really did capture what I can only now call retrofuturism. We see a lot of this when we look back at the 80s. With the modern pop art. The pseudo CGI of Max Headroom. So it's very, very retro now. But at the time, this was pretty futuristic looking stuff. I think it's cool.
Yeah, I think so.
Now, Airfix, he eventually landed on what's basically a black sketch that he needed bolstered by another artist, and he enlists Bernard Gudernas. Let's say
sounds good enough to me.
Oh, I like it. Well done. Gudernas leaned heavily into futuristic designs.
Yeah.
Is this the first time we've discussed airbrushing? Because only when you're talking about the 80s would you call airbrushing futuristic.
It's a good point. Yeah, I think we've touched on a number of albums that have used airbrushing to some extent.
I'd imagine so, yeah. It's funny because, I don't have that artist brain because my impossibly limited knowledge of the art form sends me more to the boardwalk of your favorite shitty ocean town and the legions of those T-shirt places that will put your head on one of those for about 20 months.
I think of the high school graduation pictures where they take all your pimples away.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Now, one of the things that's kind of a breath of fresh air is that there doesn't seem to be much misremembering or bickering here. Gudernas and Airfix. Yeah. Don't try and claim full responsibility for.
But that's only because we got one side of the story.
Well, yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah, it's if you're the only one being talked to, it's a nice thing. But it does essentially sound like they put their heads together and kind of knocked it out.
Yeah.
Teamwork makes a dream work, as they say, right?
It sounds like Gudernas did it, and Airfix wants to still own it.
Yes, certainly. Now, I do like the contention that adding the site creates an additional viewer, that viewer being the consumer.
Yeah.
Kind of a neat idea.
Gives you a different...
It does.
It does. A different approach to the cover.
And, it's funny, we just recently did an episode...
You're the perpetrator.
Yeah. We recently did a Green Day episode, which I'm sure you've listened to by now, that, incorporating the buyer into the theme of the whole album. Everyone's the American idiot. But here, what's that trying to say? Are we all attacking that same materialistic world by listening to this rock and roll album?
Yeah, I think maybe that is it. Yeah, join us.
Yeah. Let's burn it all up, right?
Let's blow it all up. Let's tear it all down.
But in the meantime, make sure you listen to our albums. We're invested monetarily. So a little of both. But I can't imagine this with a different background. I mean, Joe Elliott was talking about how initially it was either white or a transition from white into black. As small a detail as that may seem, I think it's the black that gives it this futuristic, austere vibe. Yeah,
that sells it.
It really sells. It just pops better that way.
It's much too tame if it's white.
Now, let's talk about that rear cover. Singer Joe Elliott was not happy with it, and I got to be honest.
With good reason.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Man, I can't blame him.
There's nothing happening there.
It's like it's as if they forgot it was going to press, and they're like, "Oh my gosh, we have 5 minutes. Let's make a back cover.
Yeah, I hate that. You flip the album over and all you see is a list of credits or something like this.
Or songs in the wrong order. It's like there was no thought, no effort, as if their entire, spiritual energy was wasted, doing the front. But it's just so bad when you compare it to the front. The photographs are really crudely and poorly arranged. I think there's 5 of them. But that's altogether more interesting, considering the band's first mega hit.
There was a bit of drama about picking the photographs. I left that out of the story because I think it's better left out. But but there was quite a bit of drama about who picked what picture.
All right, well, hop on in there, your Google search engine. But got to talk 9/11, right? That's never a fun sentence, but, with regards to Pyromania, the attacks on 9/11 really affected a lot of different pieces of art. It had a seismic effect on culture that we'll never really be able to fully grasp, especially some 20-ish years on. 164 songs were almost immediately banned from radio play.
Wow.
In the wake of the event. Yeah, pretty wild. Movies as seemingly innocent as E.T. and shows as wholesome as Sesame Street actually scrambled to edit and remove things that they thought people might find offensive.
Images of the tower?
Not even necessarily images of the tower, but just different uses of language. There were, in one case, in E.T., there's he calls his friend a terrorist.
Yeah, I found it kind of grandiose that they were considering, do we need to change this cover based on 9/11? I thought, well, wait a minute.
Well, and,
your cover's not that impactful or culturally significant.
It's not that timeless, the music of Def Leppard is still very, very much played on classic rock radio. They have a lot of fans. Certainly a lot of people still streaming their music. But to worry about an album that was damn near 20 years old at the time, certainly not your biggest one. Seems like a bit of an overreaction or a reach to get yourselves back into
that was a time for overreaction. We were in shock.
It was.
We were in shock. So everybody gets a pass for their first response.
Yeah, but this wasn't that Arnold Schwarzenegger film Collateral Damage that literally had the Twin Towers falling in the film, People were not worried about what Pyromania was saying, but the band went through a lot of different personal struggles and accidents and wild things that led to their next album, Hysteria, which, in my opinion, is far superior as an album cover, though the story may not be. But we'll talk to you about what we'll talk about next time.
Next time.